At this point, I'm going to launch into the 10:45 to noon session titled Tires and the Environment, and I'm going to turn it over to Mustafa Batan, who's also one of my favorites, Senior Waste Management Engineer with CalRecycle, and he's going to moderate this session. So Moose, take it away.
Thank you, Kyle. Welcome to session 2 of the 2024 California Tire Conference. My name is Mustafa Batan. I'm a supervising senior waste management engineer at CalRecycle, and I will be the session moderator. The session is being recorded and will be made available to watch after the conference. As a reminder for our virtual audience, you can ask questions during the session via questions widget. Q&A widget. Please note speaker's name and then your question if applies to a particular speaker. Q&A will be at the end of the Q&A will be at the end of the session when everybody presents and completes their presentations. Our speakers today will be Dr. Kelly Grant, a senior environmental scientist at California Department of Toxic Substance Control. Dr. Grant will provide an update on DTSC's Safer Consumers Product Program's work on emerging contaminants in tires. And then we also have Dr. Kelly Moran, a senior scientist at San Francisco Estuary Institute. Dr. Moran will share the recent results of the regional monitoring program for water quality in San Francisco Bay, showing Bay Area stormwater contains elevated levels of contaminants relating to motor vehicle tires. And then we also have Dr. Brad Finney, an emeritus professor of environmental resources engineering at California State Polytechnic University at Humboldt. Dr. Finney will discuss typical amounts of 6-ppdq release from TDA and potential reduction when it passed through soil layers. Detailed bios of our speakers can be found on the online agenda, so all the details will be there. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Kelly Grant to start the presentation.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the Safer Consumer Products Program and our work on 6-ppd and other tire-related chemicals. So for decades, researchers in Washington State observed mass die-offs of coho salmon. And typically they saw these deaths occurring in coho salmon prior to spawning. So on the slide on the left, you can see, on the right, you can see a coho that died full of those bright red eggs. And it appeared that the fish were in respiratory distress when this was occurring. And they saw mortality rates as high as 90% in the coho, whereas another type of salmon, chum, were totally unaffected in those very same streams. They named this urban runoff mortality syndrome, or ERMS, and they found that these ERMS events correlated with storms and roads or impervious surfaces. Because of that correlation, researchers started to look at tires as the source of the toxicant that was causing ERMS. And they did some very elegant chemistry, which I will just say is what is shown on the right side of your screen here. And I'll skip over the details of that. And they ultimately identified 6-ppd quinone as the toxic agent. Levels of 6-ppd quinone have been found in roadway runoff above the LC50 value for coho. Now that LC50 is the value or concentration of a chemical that can kill 50% of the species. They've also found that juvenile coho are sensitive to 6-ppd quinone. And subsequent researchers have also found that rainbow trout, which is the same species as steelhead, brook trout, and now lake trout are sensitive to 6-ppdq. So 6-ppd quinone, or Q, is a transformation product of 6-ppd. It was totally uncharacterized before 2021. But 6-ppd was flagged for concerns through an organization called OSPR, which is a European agency that protects the marine environment. It was flagged for concerns with aquatic toxicity, as well as bioaccumulation and persistence. We've subsequently learned persistence is probably not so much of a problem for 6-ppd itself, and 6-ppd quinone seems to be more environmentally stable. So I want to take a step back again, and 6-ppd is the primary anti-degradant used in tires. As far as we know, it is used in all tires, and it's designed to react with ozone. So in the figure, you can see rubber that's been treated with 6-ppd. There's no cracking in that rubber. On the other hand, in the other panel, in rubber without 6-ppd, you can see that the ozone has caused cracking. Basically, the ozone attacks the bonds in the rubber and breaks it down, and that would be very detrimental to tires. I certainly would not want to drive on tires that looked like that. So 6-ppd makes up somewhere between 0.5 to 2% of the mass of the tire. And by design, 6-ppd migrates to the surface of the tire to prevent any damage to the rubber from the ozone. So the other thing that we're continuing to learn about is the pervasiveness of both 6-ppd and 6-ppd quinone in the environment. So we continue to learn more about tire and road wear particles, and that's what this conceptual exposure model really focuses on. These tire and road wear particles carrying 6-ppd and 6-ppd quinone to various places throughout the environment. And so subsequent research has shown that they are found pervasively in environmental media and biota. A recent paper came out just maybe 2 weeks ago that 25% of leafy vegetables purchased in Switzerland and I think Israel had 6-ppd in them. Relatively low levels, but they're there in our food. These chemicals have also been found in humans. One paper reported that 6-ppd quinone is found, or was found in cerebrospinal fluid, indicating it can penetrate the blood-brain barrier. Similarly, there have been some studies in mice indicating that 6-ppd quinone can pass through the placenta. So these are two cases where 6-ppd quinone can penetrate these barriers that are generally set up to protect really delicate tissues. And now we don't know whether there's particular harm from these chemicals, but I think this really demonstrates the pervasiveness of these chemicals in the environment. Now you'll notice that this conceptual model, as I mentioned, mostly focuses on tire and road wear particles. It doesn't address scrap tires or beneficial reuse of tires. And some of those uses are a bit of a data gap, but some Dr. Finney will present on his efforts to fill some of those data gaps. And I also want to focus on mitigation here. This is not intended to be a gloom and doom talk. I'm going to show you a slide in just a minute that represents some good that can come out of this. My friend, Dr. Kelly Moran, will talk a little bit about some of the mitigation approaches that can be used for 6-ppd-quinone. But I'm just going to highlight one. So this is a slide from Stephanie Blair, who's a grad student in Jen McIntyre's lab. And in the control fish, you can see a coho, that's been treated with just clean well water. It's happy, it's swimming around, it's doing its thing. In the middle panel, you'll see a coho that was treated with roadway runoff. And you can see it's pretty much moribund. It's floating to the surface and gasping for air. In the third panel, you'll see a fish that was treated with that very same roadway runoff, but it was filtered through a bioretention column first. And you can see that that fish is happy and swimming around beautifully. So this represents, or this indicates really, that mitigation can be a very effective approach to deal with 6-ppd-quinone, but we need to look upstream. We can't just focus on mitigation. And that's where the Safer Consumer Products Program comes in. So in the Safer Consumer Products Program, or SCP, we regulate product chemical combinations, and we call these priority products. And when people say, or when people hear me say we regulate a chemical, they often think that means a ban. And that is not what we do. Instead, we require manufacturers to systematically evaluate alternatives. So 6-ppd in tires was proposed as a priority product in 2021, and the regulations went into effect in October of last year. So before I get going, I just want to orient you to how SEP works. Our regulatory process involves 4 different elements. The first is our candidate chemical list. That's the menu of chemicals that we can choose to regulate. And it's generally an aggregated list from authoritative bodies like US EPA. But SEP can also add to that list as well, and I'll talk about that a bit later. In the second step, we identify product chemical combinations with the potential to cause harm. In the third step, we do alternatives analyses, and that's when manufacturers evaluate this, safer alternatives, excuse me. And in the fourth step, regulatory response, that comes back to DTSC to propose ways to mitigate the harm from a particular priority product. So in the second step, that's really where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. And this is where SEP does research to evaluate various product chemical combinations for the potential to cause harm. We have a very precautionary approach, and we use a narrative standard where we simply have to demonstrate potential for exposure from the chemical, or from the product to the chemical, and for the potential for significant or widespread impacts from that exposure. And because we have this precautionary approach, we were able to move very quickly on 6-ppd. So we did this rulemaking step to list 6-ppd as a priority product because 6-ppd-quinone is found above lethal levels in California. And that's largely thanks to efforts by Dr. Moran's organization, SFEI. And because of that, we could demonstrate that there are adverse impacts to coho in California. We have 2 populations one that's endangered and one that's threatened. And many Native American tribes in California rely on salmon as both part of their culture as well as their diet. And so loss of coho could have adverse impacts on those tribal nations. Don't think that went for, I see. And we began rulemaking in May 2022. Sorry about that. So in our third step, that's when manufacturers complete an alternatives analysis. And the goal of that alternatives analysis is to have manufacturers find safer alternatives. We really place the responsibility on the product manufacturers because they have the technical expertise to understand what is going to work in a tire. And so in our standard SEP process, these alternatives analyses take place in 2 steps. So the first step is the preliminary AA. That's a wide screening of different types of alternatives. And then the manufacturers narrow down their choices to a few select alternatives to be evaluated in greater depth in the final AA. So the goal of the AA is to identify safer alternatives, or if we could flip that around, we could also say to avoid regrettable substitutes. And I wanted to go through some examples of what might be seen as a regrettable substitute. So those would be chemicals with similar or worse hazards. But in the context here, we want tires that have the same durability or improved durability to what we have now. We don't want a chemical to replace 6-PPD that would reduce the durability of tires. That would be regrettable. And certainly, we want to make sure that rolling resistance is preserved or even decreased so that we can ensure that tires have high efficiency. So the SEP process is a multi-step process by design. We want manufacturers to have time to search for alternatives. So I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but at the end of March of this year, manufacturers turned in their preliminary alternatives analyses. So we have reviewed all those and sent out notices of deficiency to manufacturers, and they are working on their revisions, and those should come back to us in about a month. About a year after that, our final alternatives analyses will be due, though manufacturers have the opportunity to extend or to ask for extensions because of the very technical nature of tires and the amount of product testing that will be required. So what did we see in these preliminary alternatives analyses? Well, we had 74 manufacturers or manufacturers of retread tell us that they make tires containing 6-PPD and sell them in California. Fortunately, many of those companies collaborated to turn in AAs. So we had 15 unique alternatives analyses of varying quality, admittedly. Of that 74, 33 companies were represented by the USTMA consortium. And then we had 22 other, mostly Asian companies with smaller market shares turn in AAs. We also issued 21 notices of non-compliance for companies that did not turn in their alternatives analyses. What did we see? We saw a lot of manufacturers propose to use other PPD derivatives as alternatives. Now, we know that many of these also form quinones. although there's some preliminary research that indicates that 6-ppd quinone might be uniquely toxic. So I think the jury's still out on whether these might be regrettable or not, and it's really up to the manufacturers to prove that they are not. In addition, we saw some non-PPD derivatives that were submitted, and maybe I'll highlight a couple here. Graphene was one of them, and then lignin, which is a waste product of paper and pulp mills, seems to have at least antioxidant activity, if not antiozonant activity. Now I'm going to highlight some other work related to tires that we're doing. So we were petitioned to add motor vehicle tires containing zinc as a priority product. We are working on finalizing the rulemaking documents associated with that, and my colleague Michael Ernst is here, so if anybody wants to talk to him about that, please do. We're continuing to monitor the science in regard to other chemicals associated with tires and work with SFEI on that. And then in regard to artificial turf, we will be releasing a background document and hosting a workshop on that later this year. But spoiler alert, we are not proposing to regulate the infill at this point. In addition, we're proposing to add a couple classes of chemicals to our candidate chemical list, and those include PPD derivatives and microplastics. Our definition of chemicals is quite broad, and so we can add microplastics as a chemical. In addition, I want to highlight that our priority product work plan is now available for public comment. And the most relevant category here are motor vehicle parts and accessories, as well as maintenance and repair materials. So if you want to hear more about that, come chat with us afterwards. And with that, I will say thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly Grant. Please hold off your questions. We will take the questions after everybody presents and all the presenters complete their presentations. With that, we will have Dr. Kelly Moran next.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity to share the latest from us. And I want to start out by saying I'm going to say some stuff that isn't going to make everybody happy here. And it's not because I want to do that. And so it was actually very difficult to prepare this presentation because we wanted to give you the most accurate and best information. And it's out of my personal and our organization's tremendous respect for the work that the folks here do, because managing end-of-life tires is an incredible challenge for California, for the world, for our environment. It's a product that's not going away. It's a product with a lot of environmental challenges. So I wanted to give you the straight dope as best as we could and tell you where we think the information gaps are, and it's out of our respect for you. So just want to lay that right out there. I will be sharing work that was done with some key collaborators. The monitoring work was done in collaboration with Ed Kaloge's lab and in Kathy Peter. That lab is actually the lab that first discovered 6-ppd quinone. A postdoc there, Zenyu Tian, was the lead on that amazing discovery, and we've been working with them for years. Since they discovered 6-ppd quinone, we have been working with them to do monitoring of it, so we're kind of excited to have that partnership there. And then I want to highlight a couple members of our internal team at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, Dr. Rebecca Sutton, Dr. Ezra Miller, lead chemist for emerging contaminants, and our toxicologist. I'm super happy that Dr. Grant here is a toxicologist because I probably can't answer your toxicology questions. And then our funders, the San Francisco Bay Regional Monitoring Program and the California Ocean Protection Council. As most of you probably are aware, San Francisco Bay is a large urban estuary on the west coast of California. If you flew in through San Francisco, you got to see it from the air. It's a very large estuary. So it's 3 to 12 miles wide and 48 to 60 miles long. So this is a very big body of water that we monitor. And that'll come to you in a second. It's also very urbanized. The gray that you see in that picture there, that's the urban area. That's mostly concrete. We have lots and lots of traffic, lots of roads, lots of pavement, and lots of cars. When the water runs off, all those outdoor services, the water from outdoors does not go to a sewage treatment plant almost anywhere. There's a little bit of downtown San Francisco, and as it happens, a little bit right here in downtown Sacramento in California, where water goes to a sewage treatment plant where it rains. And everywhere else in California and in 85% of North America, it flows directly to creeks, rivers, estuaries, the ocean, without any treatment at all. There are little bits of treatment getting in. We mentioned this bioretention is one form of urban runoff treatment. Treatment is really expensive. Treating all urban runoff in California would cost hundreds of billions of dollars. That's billions with a B. So we're not expecting that to happen everywhere. So that's different than Europe, where a lot of research is from, where it does flow to a sewage treatment plant. And sewage treatment plants are actually pretty good at removing little particles like tire wear and a lot of the chemicals in them. So that's not the story here. You all are probably extremely aware that tires wear off during use. I don't have to tell you that story. And as Dr. Grant mentioned, when that wear occurs, the material comes off. It doesn't just fall on the road. It gets mixed all around and beat up by tires, and it gets spewed up into the air and spreads all over the environment in the area. Most of the mass falls within about 30 feet of the road, but the little tiny particles can go for very long distances. Those little tiny particles are so small that we breathe them, and that's one of the main exposures. So that's why Dr. Grant mentioned the human exposures that we see. It can also fall on places that, like our children, touch the dust and put it in their mouths, and it can fall on our crops. Pavement also wears off during use. So RMA, for example, wears off during use. And we think about it, but we don't think about it in this context. You can see that when you look at tire wear particles. As others have mentioned, sometimes they call them tire and road wear particles. So these are scanning electron microscope images, so really, really tiny microscope images of tires. And you can see there's like little stones and little bits and white stuff in there. That's not tire material, that's stuff from the road. So some of that's dirt and some of that's pavement. So if you're making RMA or some other, any other ingredient in roads, that'll become part of these particles as they wear out. Roads wear off more slowly than tires, but they do come off. So one of the things that we've done is estimate the total amount of tire wear emissions into the Bay Area and importantly into California. And I can tell anybody who wants to know about these estimates, but it's about 100 to 120 million kilograms per year. The amount per person is about the volume. Imagine holding a newborn baby or maybe a large cat. That's your personal annual emissions of tires. That doesn't just come from your vehicle, but all the shipping and other things that are going on to support your life. It's quite a bit of material. It is less than the amount of end-of-life tires that are managed in California. I grabbed this from the CalRecycle-California data. This suggests about 5 times more mass material is end-of-life tires, and that may or may not be exactly right comparison, but just give you the idea of the sense of scale. The tire wear material, as I mentioned, it washes off almost always without any kinds of treatment before it flows into surface water bodies. Most of that, or that winds up, the particles are microplastics. So our institute did a microplastic monitoring project back in 2019 and discovered that the largest source of microplastic in the San Francisco Bay Area, and now this appears to be true throughout the world, is tire wear material. So the single largest source of microplastic is actually tire wear material. It's not bottles and all those other things. We estimated 5 trillion microplastic particles would enter that San Francisco Bay every year. Now we have more information about tire particle size distributions. We missed some. It's probably about 20 times 5 trillion. It's a lot. Now, tire material, microplastics are interesting because they are harmful in and of themselves. The small particles, organisms eat them and think they're food, and there's all kinds of other effects that can occur. In addition, tire particles and many other microplastics also contain chemicals. So we've been talking about 6-ppd quinone. So we see them as something that helps release those chemicals into the environment and can carry them all the way into organisms. So it's a story about particles and chemicals, and I'll be talking about that from here on. I don't need to go into this in detail because Dr. Grant already talked about it, but our monitoring data help make that connection between 6-ppd in tires to 6-ppd quinone to the runoff into surface water. And our monitoring in the Bay Area was the first in the world to show exactly how high those concentrations might be. We're seeing similar concentrations from elsewhere around the world, so we're not unique. Let's see, why is this not going forward? There we go, okay. So one good piece of news is that chemical release from material in the environment is related to the surface area. So both the reactions that occur that form 6-ppd quinone from 6-ppd, those happen at the surface. And the release, the actions that cause the chemical to be released also happen at surfaces. So tire particles have huge surface area. It's like you took a piece of paper and you crumble it all up into a little tiny ball. There's a ton of surface area inside. Most of the products that you guys are making, the cutting processes are going to give them a lot less surface area. So it'd be like taking a piece of paper that you've crumpled up and comparing that to the surface area of a tennis ball. So there's a lot less surface area. So that's good in the sense of the speed of release or formation of other kinds of chemical things. The bad news is as it ages, those larger particles can degrade and slowly over a really long time have the potential to release chemicals. But it won't happen all at once. There'll be a bunch at the beginning, and then it'll be there, so it becomes a little store of those chemicals for later on. So that's something that we think about as folks in the environmental science field. So here's where we start the bad news. There is a growing body of evidence that tire toxicity is occurring due to chemicals other than 6-ppd quinone. So people are testing the particles, the leachates that don't include the particles. They're testing lots of different kinds of organisms. And much of this testing is at environmental relevant concentrations, so not all of it. There's people who are testing at higher concentrations that would really occur, and that's just to get a sense of what's going on. So I don't expect you to read this eye chart. This is an excerpt from a literature review, but what you can see here is a whole bunch of species in one of the red boxes and a whole bunch of toxic effects in one of the other red boxes here. So basically tons of different species are having a bunch of different effects. So these are all species that are not sensitive to 6-ppd quinone. So what's going on? One of the things that's going on is zinc. So Dr. Grant mentioned zinc, and the species highlighted in yellow here are known to be sensitive to zinc. So there are a couple other here that I think are probably also sensitive to zinc, but again, it doesn't tell the whole story. There's species here that are not sensitive to zinc. So our conclusion is that there are tire-related chemicals other than 6-ppd quinone and zinc that have the potential to harm aquatic ecosystems. So what are those chemicals? Well, this is what we're trying to find out, because the more information that we can give to tire manufacturers, the smarter they can be about making safer products. It's a long journey to safer products, and the more we can tell people, the smarter they can be in that design. And that helps make end-of-life management easier and safer and cheaper. So this is from a just published review paper that took a look at all the information about chemicals that can be in tires, everything tire-related, leached out, and so forth. And we took those chemicals for which we had monitoring data. So this is just a subset of all the chemicals that are out there. We could measure and environmentally monitor for them. And tire-related chemicals are ubiquitous in the San Francisco Bay environment. It's in the water, it's in the sediment, it can be in biota. I'm going to tell you the story about 3 different of these chemicals just to show you an example, convince you we're really doing the monitoring and so forth. I'm going to whip through this pretty fast in the interest of time, and would be happy to come back and answer questions about any of this during the discussion period. So these 3 chemicals appear to be primarily linked to tires. So 6-ppd quinone is one of them. There's one called affectionately DPG. And my favorite one is another a tire additive that's called HMMM. So we sometimes joke and call it So those that those chemicals are associated with tires, so we actually don't know about how they're used or whether they're degradation from other things, what's going on with them in the formulation. So here's our monitoring design. This just presents the last 3 years' worth of data. It's not all published, and I'd request you not take photographs of this since it's unpublished data. Some of it will be published very soon. We sample urban stormwater, so that means runoff that is actually in creeks. That's what we're sampling. And we go out in the middle of storms, which usually means in the middle of the night, so folks who really like getting wet are doing that. It's a lot of fun. We also take samples at sites that we think are going to be reference locations, so are going to be not draining highly urbanized areas. Turns out we detected some stuff. We're not perfect at finding those locations. They're really hard to find. We also look at the shoreline area of the bay. That's important habitats right near the mouths of creeks. And we go out there a couple tidal cycles after the storm, so there's been some time for the water to mix around and dilute, but it's still hanging out there. And then a week to 10 days or so after storms, we'll go out in the middle of the bay and take samples there. Those are the blue dots. We also go out in the summer dry season, because here we have the Mediterranean climate. It doesn't rain in the summer, and take samples then. So our hypothesis is that we'll see the highest concentrations in stormwater runoff. We'll see still some concentrations in the area near the shoreline of the bay, and we might see some chemicals in the middle of the bay, but that should be pretty diluted. And that's pretty much what we see. So this is results for 2 chemicals, and if you start on the left on each of these 2 charts, that's the dry season. We don't see any meaningful detections of these 2 chemicals there. Our reference locations, we're getting a little bit of stuff. That's probably explained by all those little tiny particles that fly really far away. The stormwater concentrations, you see that really high bar there, that's stormwater. So that's what's happening in the runoff. And then the bay near the shoreline, as expected, it's diluted. Interestingly, we are detecting concentrations of tire-related chemicals right in the middle of the bay more than a week after it rains. That's a really big water body to see a signal primarily from one product. Same story, same pattern for 6-PPD quinone. Last time I gave this talk, we didn't have any 6-BPD quinone detections in the bay. Now we do. I'm really sorry that that's the case. The stormwater concentrations here, so I'm just going to walk through a little bit about how we assess data when we do this. So I'm going to compare this to the coho toxic concentrations. And I should note, for those who are purists, coho don't live in San Francisco Bay watersheds anymore and haven't been present since the 60s or early 70s. That may or may not be related to tires. There's also a lot of other bad things that have happened in our creeks, so we can't prove or deny anything there. Coho do live in lots of other urban watersheds around the western U.S. We have other kinds of salmon, particularly steelhead, that appear to be sensitive to 6-PPD quinone as well. So this is a story that's still really important for us. So what we see is that there's a range of different papers with different age coho. So there's a range in different lethal concentrations, but you can see the stormwater concentrations are clearly within that range. There are no data about sublethal toxicity, so the stuff that doesn't kill the fish, but isn't bad for them and for other aquatic organisms. So we don't really know what that will be. People use aquatic life reference values to interpret data and decide if there's potentially a problem. And EPA just released an aquatic life screening value. This is, again, just for acute short-term exposures and for 6-PPD quinone, and that's 11 nanograms per liter, which is just amazingly tiny. Our detection limit is the best in the world at 2.5 nanograms per liter. So it's a really small amount. Washington just proposed a water quality standard at 8. So basically, you're not going to be able to, you're going to have to not detect 6-PPD quinone to protect waters. So now let's turn to the products that are really the focus of this conference. So we've done 3 reviews of the literature in 2020, again, when we wrote the joint paper, and then we took a closer look at RMA material, because I knew that was the highest importance for this conference, to give you some feedback about the potential risks. And as I mentioned, the risks of the use of this product have to do with particles, so those little microplastic particles. If it's smaller than 5 millimeters, it's a microplastic, and the chemicals leaching from it. So 3 products that I want to highlight, so generally feedstocks. So that means if you're making stuff, if you're at a site where you're doing some mixing or using, how you manage that is really important, and making sure that it's not getting out and getting away as particles, and that the runoff is being managed improperly. And the fines in larger products can also be an issue. So if it's not sieved in a way that keeps those fines off of the end-use site, that's something that is also at issue. Artificial turf infill, the number one question I get is about artificial turf infill and playground uses. The number two one I get is about RMA. And those are the questions we always get. We know there are losses because that's why infill has to be replaced. And there are data that do show that tire-related chemicals do appear in the runoff from fields that contain tire infill. So that's an issue that we're seeing that as something that could have a localized effect on a local watershed. We haven't got the resolution of our data to be able to analyze whether that's true on a larger scale like the Bay watershed. It's actually something Mustafa and we've been talking about, if we could potentially do that kind of analysis of our data, and it's too soon. The stormwater treatment use is also one that gets a lot of attention for the same reasons. It's that long-term stuff sitting in water and the potential for long-term release of these chemicals, and some of them can be harmful in very small concentrations, these nanograms per liter. Then pavement is, of course, the other really big topic. Here, we spent a lot of time actually working with the team here, Joaquin and Mustafa's predecessors, to really trying to understand how that might work, what are the potentials for release, and what are the risks. So if any whole crumb is used actually in the final pavement, that has the potential to release microplastics. So if it is to the current Caltrans standard and you're actually melting the crumb with the asphalt material, that should not ever release microplastics, so that's really cool. But if it's a cold mix or something that leaves whole crumb in the pavement material, that means that as the pavement wears, the whole crumb can come out. And then chemical leaching is also a concern. Based on the wear rates alone and the particle possibilities, it definitely appears that tire wear is a greater risk than RMA. So, and under the California standards. Pavement coatings are another topic. We spent a lot of time looking at it and trying to understand that, and there's just not a lot of data. Pavement coatings are particularly of concern because they wear off. So you put it on, it wears off much more quickly. So if it's got particles or other stuff in it, you're going to have a lot of exposure. The bad news is that even with all the reviews that we've done, we reviewed all the literature out there, and it's really conflicting. So there is not literature to tell us any of this is okay. So I'd like to be able to tell you that, and I can't. Actually see studies that say there's really some potential problems here. So small number of studies, conflicting results. Most don't reflect real road environments. The really great designs, Dr. Finney's lab did one where they were actually looking at road segments right next to each other with and without RMA and looking at aged pavements. Those are really awesome designs. A lot of lab studies just use water. They don't have, or they use a fake stormwater that doesn't include all the organic constituents that are key to the runoff. So the study design isn't right, and it doesn't give you the answer you think you're getting from the study, and that's a real concern, because then you're not learning what you want to learn. And a lot of people compare their results to the wrong toxicity values, like a human drinking water standard, instead of something for aquatic life in a receiving water. So this is an active area of research. I expect us to change, and I'm hoping that the industry will be contributing to that. So quickly, I know I'm running over, mitigation is available, as Dr. Grant mentioned. So there are management practices on site for handling material. There are, in addition to the bioretention runoff treatment, there is the potential that porous pavement might be really helpful in this regard if it is properly maintained. So porous pavement does tend to clog up, and then it's just as bad as any other pavement. But there is something out there. So there are partnerships for solutions, but it adds cost to construction projects that would be using, for example, RMA. So the conclusions here, the take-home messages are that tire particles and tire-related chemicals can threaten water quality due to both the microplastic particles and the chemicals in them. Tire-derived products could contribute to water quality risk. I'd say a lot of unknowns in this. And those localized things that happen near the sites of use are potentially really important. For pavement, the research is not sufficient to say everything's safe. But that's a real open question. And in terms of research priorities, I really recommend future studies on RMA in particular, since that's such an important use here. Really having a good solid body of science would make a real difference in understanding what needs to be paired with, if anything, RMA installations and rubber-containing pavement coatings, because that's another really broad use. Thank you for your time and attention. More info on our website. If you go to my bio webpage, there's actually a publications tab with a lot of stuff there. And thank you.
Thank you so much for the detailed and informative presentation. Dr. Brad Finney will be next.
Hi, and thanks. So taking a little different tact here from the previous two, which said, yeah, we got a problem. I'm an engineer and I like to solve problems, or at least try to find solutions. So that's a little bit of what we're trying to look at here today. About 10 years ago, there was quite a bit of media attention to a large open, what they call a graveyard, the largest graveyard of tires in the world, that was in Kuwait of all places. And why, I don't know why in Kuwait, but that's where they were. And the pictures, it just was this sea of tires. And they said, well, yeah, it's like 40 million tires. It seemed like an incredible amount until you realize that in California, we're currently generating 60 million, so double almost the largest graveyard, and that's every year. So it's a lot of tires to get rid of or do something with. And CalRecycle, as part of their mission, is trying to identify and promote responsible reuse options for those end-of-life tires, so you do something with all that material. There are a number of possible products get produced, one of which is tire-derived aggregate. There's a picture of it here, and it just tire shred, and it is a product that has found a lot of use in engineering applications. Now, those uses are typically in an unsaturated setting. So we're not, they're below ground, they're subsurface. And a few examples here, we have landfill cover, that was mentioned earlier, landfill day cover. That's a lot of materials used. This picture here was taken at the Kiefer landfill here in Sacramento. That's one example. It's been used as an embankment fill. So you see the material being laid down there and then eventually has a soil cap over it. It has been used for a fill behind retaining walls or pile walls. Again, example here, kind of before and after you see the material. And even in cases where we're using it for dampening of vibration along transit routes, in this case, BART transportation. In each of those settings, there is some potential, while it's not always, but there is some potential for intermittent wetting. And in some cases, even some of these uses, that it's not just possible, but it's probable or even intentional that material will get wet. None of the reuse options for end-of-life tires that CalRecycle promotes will result in direct runoff of leachate from the TDA to a surface water environment. That, however, there is, of course, going to be some subsurface runoff occurring, some leachate. Because of that, there's been a lot of research over the last 20 years or so, 25 years really, for what is the fate in the subsurface environment of the chemicals that come off of, contaminants that come off of TDA when exposed to water. And at least all the studies that had been done over that period of time have found that the soil media itself that surrounds the TDA typically retains or transforms. The processes are not always completely understood, but by and large, the plume, the contaminant plume, has not been found to migrate more than just a few feet away from the fill itself. So the soil has done a good job of retaining the metals and a variety of organic and inorganic compounds. However, one of the compounds that has not been examined in those studies is 6-PPD and its transformation product, 6-PPDQ. So the question that we were interested in looking at is, well, does the soil layer retain that material or transform that particular compound in the subsurface environment? So we wanted to look at that issue, and this is just a very preliminary, quick, the idea of quick study to see what we could find. We started off, unfortunately, right in the pandemic, so the labs were closed. Our lab at the university was closed. It was almost impossible to get in to do work. The other issues we had was there's not many commercial labs that do the analysis in California for 6-PPDQ. They take 3 to 4 weeks for turnaround time. It's unbelievably $450 per sample. So that limits the number of samples we could take. And we found, as you'll see later, the reliability of the labs in terms of producing results that were meaningful was very, I would say, poor at best, almost terrible. And in addition, we had this issue, how are we going to produce enough 6-PPDQ water to use as our influent source? And we didn't want to just use stormwater. We wanted a reliable source at a high enough concentration. So what we were looking for is some source water that would exceed the kind of concentrations found in really bad cases in stormwater, which was greater than 2,000 nanograms per liter. We wanted it to come from a rubber product so that other constituents within that source water would mimic what we would find in the field environment. And we wanted to be relatively inexpensive. We want to produce lots of it, if possible, many gallons. But we also didn't want to have minimize the possibility of interference in terms of the analysis from the lab for the measuring 6-PPDQ. So we set out looking with 3 different source materials with TDA, crumb rubber, and then rubber mulch. Rubber mulch is really just like TDA, except there's no wires in it and has a slightly smaller area. As both Kellys have mentioned, that the concentration that we might get out of these products would be proportional to the surface area to volume. So that kind of argued that crumb rubber might give us our best result. However, working with crumb rubber, it's a mess to deal with. So it's too small. But in any event, those are the 3 products we looked at. The things we did, we soaked it in water for different lengths of time, which is the example, soaking the TDA and then crumb rubber on the right there. We also tried simple things like just putting TDA in a basket, sprinkling water over it. That was simple and fast. Mustafa here participated in one such exercise himself. He was very good at sprinkling water on there. Did a good job at that. So, and so begins our saga. So we tried, very first experiment there on the left, 7 days and 14 days. We got some results like, oh, okay, those are great concentrations. So then we thought, well, but it'd be nice if we could get even higher concentration, because then we could dilute, we could essentially get more for our effort. So we tried tire crumb, thinking higher surface area should get higher concentrations. That might, so kind of true for 7 days, but the 14-day one, 46, what happened there? Now, through the rest of this talk, you're going to see numbers in red. Those numbers in red were ultimately, not initially, but ultimately determined by the laboratory that we use to be of no useful purpose. They're wrong. They're way off. In some cases, and then they don't, in some cases they couldn't retest, in some cases they tried to retest, but this, and I want to emphasize that the lab themselves did not them recognize these values were bad. It was only after we came back months later and said, are you sure about these values, that they re-examined their results and said, oh, yeah, okay, throw those away. So that kind of added a complication to our study also. We tried aerating the TDA and the crumb to be sure there was sufficient oxygen available for the oxidation process from 6 ppd to 6 ppdq. And you see here what happened. We aerated for a half an hour and then for almost a full day. And you notice those numbers are way lower than you saw on the last slide, also all in red, also garbage. So remember, this represents about 4 months of time, of our time, to both perform the experiment, send the results off, and then get back nonsense. And at this point, we didn't know they were bad. We just couldn't figure out, what's going on? How this is not for our uses. Those are concentrations were too low. We tried sprinkling water over the TDA and the crumb. The part of that purpose was to see what happens if you had a pile of TDA at a construction site and you had rain on it, the runoff, what effect would that have? And so that was part of the reason. And also, it would just give us a way to look to see what would happen if this is the method we're going to use to prepare our influent. And you notice, again, some nonsensical results. The first pass on the left there, we got 5,200. We take the water off of that runoff and put it through again, and the concentration goes down. That seems unlikely, but that's what the lab reported. The tire crumb, that is just 40 and 42. Those are impossibly low. Now, I want to point out here that the numbers on the left, the lab stood by those values. I mean, we had obviously no way to know whether they're correct, but they didn't make any sense. Getting further frustrated, we decided that we ought to maybe use another lab. So we used a second lab number 2, sent replicate samples, and what we found at least was that the results were similar. For me, the replicates were similar at each of the labs, but the 2 labs got obviously completely different results. Not very encouraging. The lab on the left, the only difference between the techniques that they use is the lab number 1 used what's called solid phase extraction. It's a pre-step to the analysis. And lab number 2 did not use that in terms of their sample preparation. Both labs used the standard LCMS for their final analysis. We went through the same exercise with rubber mulch. Rubber mulch was a nice product to work with. The results were not encouraging again. The 2 labs gave completely different results and a lot lower values than we anticipated. At this point, we actually had to decide we're going to continue. We were pretty discouraged. Are we even going to go forward with the real result? What we wanted was filtration. We finally decided to go ahead and proceed using the original lab for our work. We decided to use rubber mulch. And our technique for preparing our solution, influent solution to our filtration, was to soak the material overnight and then also literally sprinkle that leachate over a pile of the rubber mulch to produce our influent for our filtration. First test, 9-inch deep column of material. We used 3 different media, topsoil material, a mix of compost and topsoil, 50-50 mix, and then a commercial compost product. And you can see in the little dishes there, just showing how the same amount of material run through the muffle furnace, and you can see the difference. What's left represents in the beaker, or in the little dish there, is the non-volatile material, so obviously the compost has mostly volatile. This is what the filters look like. They're 12-inch diameter filters filled with media. There's gravel at the bottom, and then we took the water off from there. The result of our first test, again, this is just 9 inches of media, so not a lot. we got about 99% removal of material. The numbers on the red numbers again represent what they told us at the beginning the influent concentrations were. Subsequently, they revised those after we said, are you sure about those? They seem really low. And they retested, and the numbers went up by an order of magnitude. Effluent values, so we're going in about 6,000 to 7,000, come out at 20 to 30 concentrations. So really nice removal. You know, almost 2 orders of magnitude removal there. We looked then at one of the compounds, actually just to point out here that the compost and the soil compost mix did slightly better than the soil. That may be because of the additional organic material might be responsible for some of that transformation or removal of the 6-ppdq. We then looked at what effect changing the depth would have, and there was more depth, more contact time. And again, we would see as the depth increased, we went from 6 to 18 inches, the removal rates went up, probably not unexpected. And another thing to note here is that these concentrations of our influence stayed pretty much constant around 6,000. That's about as high as we could ever get. Begin to wonder whether there's some kind of saturation point there. Finally, we wanted to look at something a little less artificial, so we took construction fill material and used that as our media. That is just a typical coarse grain fill material. And again, the lab reported initially influent of about 1,985. It turns out subsequently they revised that to 6,000, so big difference. And as the purpose here was not only to see how well this particular field type soil would work, but what would happen over time. Now, it's not a lot of time, admittedly, but we took a first flush, the first 500 mLs that went through the filter, the second 500, and then the third 500, and used those concentrations. And you'll notice that the performance increased a little bit as we got higher removal with more time or more passage. But what was encouraging is that even the first bit of water that came out of the filter was not high. We didn't get some kind of breakthrough initially. So, all right. So what do we learn out of this? First off, that 95% removal or above of 6-ppdq through a soil layer, even as little as 9 inches, is possible, easily possible. And we did notice that there is a slight increase in removal rate with additional organic media, organic content in the soil media. Increase in the soil depth did increase the removal rates, and we got up to 99.8% removal in just 18 inches of soil. That was encouraging. The things that were a little bit discouraging was the analytical methods that the lab is using, at least the commercial labs available to us in California, and there's only 2 that we were aware of, has some severe problems with matrix interference. And that's with our, nice, relatively pristine mix. I would expect that the problems would be worse for real stormwater. So that, to me, brings into question the reliability of the results that we see published. I'm not talking about published papers from research labs, but from stormwater monitoring that's being done by organizations using commercial labs. I would not put a lot of faith necessarily in the results that they're getting. I'm not trying to badmouth anybody, but there's certainly some room for improvement here. And in addition, the costs are so high and the turnaround is so long that it really hinders doing good regulatory work, good research work. Where we'd like to go next, we'd really interested in the half-life. I mean, if it's taken a month to perform the experiment and get the results back, what's the half-life of these products in the surface and subsurface environment? What are the mechanisms for removal within the soil in the first place? What's the capacity of the soil media? What's its lifetime? Would we have to replace the media regularly? Do field observations that we could perform where there are existing TDA fills, subsurface fills, does it show that they're also, that the groundwater below those is low in concentrations, as 6 ppq as the lab would suggest it would be? And I have a personal interest in trying to see whether there's possible use of this material, this kind of strategy, for a passive filter for stormwater in urban areas where you could have a relatively small soil column and perform filtration of stormwater immediately following a runoff event. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Brad Finney. I just want to add one item before maybe we go to Q&A, that for all the bad samples that we were getting from the labs were either reanalyzing the same samples free of charge, or they were not charging us for another sample if the sample was past their holding time. So we're able to send another sample to them, and then they were not charging us, they were reanalyzing the samples free of charge. So there were like a few samples that we sent them and they did not charge us because they gave us bad results. With that, we will open up the Q&A and we'll take the questions from the room first, and then we could go online. We have a question up there, Lito.
Thank you very much. I'm quite sure that we will continue to look in all of not only the presentation, but all the very valuable reference as such. And of course, with the aquatic and in this case, point of view from what you show, along the U.S.-Mexico border, two main watersheds that are actually, shared, the Colorado River as well as the Rio Grande, becomes, once it gets into the urban areas, as a source for them to go to the potable treatment plants, and then becomes the source of drinking water. I'm quite sure that a lot of this information, I think we had to be looked as such. But I'm bringing into, with all of the information that you have come across, and especially with all of the different PIs that you have, as it relates to these chemicals that you're talking about, with respect to the direct human impact. And earlier in another session, it was mentioned about the kilns. And of course, when we talk about kilns, we're thinking about cement kilns. But you know that along the US-Mexico border, and especially within the country of Mexico and maybe many other countries, there's the brick kilns. And in this case, tires are in a way used as a fuel. And it becomes because, first of all, it's not expensive. They just go and get it from wherever is illegally, kind of piled. But also is a very immediate combustion. And in the case of one area that is in the state of Saltillo, it gives that kind of black and red kind of mixture that is also attractive toward this. But it is a very inefficient combustion. And in this case, families are the ones that are doing that from different generations. So back in the late 1990s, in which in Ciudad Juarez, there were a pile. It was this city pile that was just growing, and it came close to 8 million tires there. And of course, the use of it was for the cement kiln, but at the same time, we were addressing those close to 400 brick kilns just in Ciudad Juarez. And there was a paper, there was a health related, which is much broader. I think that this information really it gives a lot more toward making awareness toward the brick kiln makers and families. Because at that time, there was one of the health foundations and a well-put study in which it said that children being exposed for this, let's say, soot that was coming out from the inefficient combustion, it will have an impact of reducing the potential of learning of the children.
Okay.
And in this case, the wives said, you stop now doing that, and it worked. But that was late in the 1990s. As we look right now, 2024, brick kilns are still using the tires. So my question is,
Okay.
if there's such information, in this case, that could be helped, or if you have come across with information that is toward an efficient combustion as it relates directly
Okay.
to those exposed.
Thank you, sir. Do you want to take that, Kelly, or one of the Kellys? It's on, it's on.
Thank you. I think that's a really complicated and really important question. And I will say, I don't know enough about the combustion of tires to address that. I have that flagged as a data gap in some of the AAs, the alternatives analyses that came through when they talked about end-of-life tires and what happens to 6PPD and 6PPDQ, those that are burned for fuel. I flagged that as a data gap, but unfortunately, that's all I know right now, but very important question.
Thank you. Two more questions here. Kyle?
Thank you. Michael Ernst, DTSC's Safer Consumer Products Program. Come find me if you're interested about what we're doing about the sinking tires. My question's for Dr. Moran. In SFEI's sampling and analysis for 6PPD and 6PPDQ, did you encounter similar issues as Dr. Finney?
We have not, but we've worked very closely with Ed Cologne's lab, since they were the ones who discovered it, in terms of sample collection containers, headspace, that's the space on the sample, keeping those things there, how quickly we actually ship the samples overnight to the lab. We do a lot of blanks as standards, so they do inject an internal standard, and we do a lot of duplicate samples. So we work really hard with them to make sure that the sample cleanup and the sample analysis and so forth is really accurate. We can afford, partly because we're getting these academic rates on our sample analysis, which is less expensive than the commercial labs, and the academics are partners with us in our research capacity to do an extensive amount of quality assurance work. So it's a very difficult area, and I think Dr. Finney's experience is not unique. I've been to multiple scientific conferences where we're talking about and assessing these data. Toxicologists are trying to do measurements and make sure that the concentrations that they're using are accurate. In addition to the environmental monitoring data, a lot of stuff sticks to containers. So you can have losses just from stuff sticking to containers, so stuff sticking to soil isn't surprising to me. A lot of times folks thought that half-life was short, and it turned out it was just sticking to some various containers in the process. So getting that, the whole chain down from the point of we collect the sample all the way through the lab and the quality assurance process to an end result that we're confident in is an active area of research. So this is not a defined thing. There's work on standard EPA analytical methods. I think work still needs to be done, maybe Dr. Grant knows more about this, in terms of the sample handling methods. So that's a whole separate thing. We've got a US EPA approved analytical method in the lab, that's one thing. But how you handle the materials all the way through the process is a whole different set of methods that have to get worked out.
Okay. Go ahead, Frank. Oh, good.
Yeah, I had a question for Dr. Moran as well. You had mentioned that when crumb rubber is utilized in RMA through a heated process, there was less exposure or no exposure of 6 ppdq. Would you anticipate the same result, or do you have data regarding rubber molded products that use, some type of a binding agent to encapsulate the rubber material?
Yeah, my apologies. When I was talking about that melting together, I was thinking about the microplastic releases and not about the chemical releases. So when you have a loose piece of microplastic, so the rubber crumb product, if it's less than 5 millimeters, it's a microplastic. So if that's loose, it can come out, and that's the concern in the RMA. So if it's melted together, then it's part of it, and you don't create a microplastic. When RMA wears, it's not microplastic because it's not plastic. But I don't know the answer to that with regard to the importance of the chemical, and that's something that needs to be investigated. I'm hopeful that that's not going to be a big problem, but I don't know. The information out there is really inconclusive, and it is definitely true that for other chemicals, the addition of the rubber has shown in paired studies, in some cases and not in others, that we're seeing tire-associated chemicals at higher concentrations on the RMA surfaces. So I just feel like the studies are not conclusive.
Okay, Moose, we'll take one more question.
Yes, okay.
And then we'll send people to lunch.
So this question is for Dr. Moran. So yeah, so like 6 ppdq will be formed on the surface. 6 ppd just itself is a very stable molecule. And now, like when rain or storm happen, then that can get washed from the fresh tire. Like it may not be like 100% like that can come from these microparticles. Because microparticle will come from the tread wear. And so, like, have you done that type of analysis? Like, suppose one rain happened, then what do you see in concentration? And then maybe after a few days, or after a week, or after a month, rain happen again. Then do you see some differences in terms of concentration from the stormwater? And like, and other thing is that, have you tried to find out that is it coming from the wear particle, or maybe directly washed from the fresh tire, all the vehicle parked everywhere on the road?
These are really good questions, and I've actually heard these questions before. There's a lot more surface area on the tire wear particles than on the tires. So when you're out there on the road, there's so much more surface area on tire wear particles. Tire wear particles have, it's just unimaginably huge surface area. So my crumpled paper example is really an understatement. It's 100 square meters per gram of tire wear particle material. It's just an unimaginably huge surface area. So there's no doubt in my mind, based on the science of how that happens, that the tire wear particles are probably dominating things. In terms of rain, and then there's an antecedent period, and then it rains, another dry period, and then it rains again. It is common for all pollutants. If you have multiple days of rain, then the concentration will go down, and that just has to do with the way that pollutants are transported. So it's a really complicated story. So, but I think your fundamental question is it the surface of tires or the tire wear particles? And the answer is it's almost undoubtedly the tire wear particles because of the huge amount of surface area. And here in California, these things come off all summer. So like now, it's not gonna rain until September, October, any noticeable amount. And so all summer long, we're generating all this tire wear debris, and it's moving around, and most of it's getting stuck in dirt and never gonna wash off, but some of it's out there. And it's got all summer to be exposed to oxygen. And then when it rains, 6 ppd quinone will be washed off either through the particles washing off or the stuff coming off of the tires. But then we're continuing to drive all winter too. So there's more happening there. Sorry about that. And it's just this ongoing process, and that will be true with any of the chemicals that are within tires. As long as we're driving cars with tires, we're going to be releasing tire particles and chemicals into the environment. We can try to collect them on cars. There's some folks who are doing that. There's a whole bunch of things that we can do about that. And one of those things is making safer tires. This is a long-term journey. We're not going to fix it overnight. And how big the contribution is of various uses, that's actually a really important question for this group. I'd say the future of this area and people being confident is going to be determined by answering some of these scientific questions. I was actually thrilled to hear John Sharon talk about the industry direction in that regard and really tackling head-on some of these scientific questions with a bunch of partners so that trusted science can come out of there. I think it's really going to support the entire industry, and I really commend the industry for doing that.
Thank you, Kelly. That concludes our session, and I just want to thank the presenters one more time. Back to you, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. Fantastic panel. We have 2 lines for lunch, so it's time to eat, you guys, and then we'll be back at 1 o'clock.